Welcome, pilgrims of the earth. I'm Deacon Clark. I am called Deacon by my earthly companions. My real name is Merritt Clark. I was born in 1793, and I came from Connecticut. And the Clark family's history is deep in Connecticut. My great-great-great-grandfather, George Clark, was born in England, and he came to the New World along with his wife, my great-great-great-grandmother, Sarah, and they arrived here with 2 children in 1637. They came with the Reverend Jonathan Davenport, came with the Reverend John Davenport in order to escape the persecution they had faced in England on account of their faith. They finally settled in Milford, Connecticut, and they proceeded to have 7 more children. In my case, George begat George, and that George begat George, and that George begat Hezekiah, Hezekiah begat Aaron, and Aaron begat me, Merritt. I heard stories of the War of the Revolution from my father, Aaron, because he served in that particular war, and the company of Captain Wells. I served briefly in the Second War against the British. I was a fifer in the company of Captain Robert Gates. I was taught to be a carriage maker, and when I was of suitable age, I married Lydia Kellogg. We were blessed with 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Louisa, before she was called home at the tender age of 31. I then married Clarissa Bassett. We had 5 children: David, Edward, Lydia, Phoebe, and Clarissa. The first 3, Edward, David, and Lydia, all died before they were 5. And then Clarissa, my wife that is, she was called home in 1835. So after a few years, I was married a 3rd time, this time to Amelia Griggs. She bore a daughter, and which we named Amelia Lydia. She died before she was 1 year old. And then we had another daughter, Amelia Evans, who died by the time she was 1 month old. Now, through all these afflictions, I knew God had a design, even though I didn't know what it was. But, believe it or not, these seasons brought me the deepest and richest comfort and strength that I had ever known, and I was often drawn to prayer. Now, all these things happened while I was in Connecticut. I didn't come here until I was nearly 60 years old, and my oldest daughter, Elizabeth, was living here. And she was the wife of Mr. Albert Tuttle, who owned a trading post over at Fort Winnebago. And then he heard about the Baraboo Valley, and he heard about the new county seat here, and so he moved over this direction. They sent several letters to me, and after reading those letters, I thought this would be a good place for Amelia and me to come to kind of refresh our lives, and also to share the gospel with people who needed it. And after I got here, I knew that Baraboo really needed it. I was I was a member, became a member and a deacon of the Presbyterian congregation after it started here in 1851. But my religious convictions began in earnest when I was in Connecticut. I joined a church in Connecticut, Northfield, and this was after Lydia died, my first wife. I became a member there, but it was before I knew all the other tragic things that were to happen to me in my life. The loss of my loved ones you know about, but then there was my own sickness, and I lost my earthly property by fire 2 times. Things happened like that when I was alive then. Here, my life was not in vain, because the church flowered, and I was happy about that, and I was able to live 17 more years to watch it grow before I was taken to my rest. And when I was called home, I was writing a letter. I was in the midst of writing the letter, and it never got finished. And so I'm going to share with you just a couple sentences of that. It said, in part, "I feel an increased weakness, which calls me to know that my preparatory life is nearly done. And oh, how little and small all my life seems as a return for what Christ has done for us, and as a hope and grounds of heaven. So I give up all else and trust solely in the merits of my Savior for justification before God." I thank you all for coming, but most of all, I thank you for the opportunity to kind of come round again and tell you a piece of my life, so that all of you know that this place is just not full of tombstones. It's full of lives lived. Merritt Clark, known as Deacon. That's what the DEA is. Good to have you.
Welcome everyone. Forgive me for staring. I don't think I've ever seen such a variety of shoes in my life before. The name's Andy Andrews. You can probably tell where I come from, well, at least the country that is. I was born in the town of Hereford, well, the county of Herefordshire actually, the town of Ledbury. It says it right there on my tombstone. That's where I learnt the art of the shoemaking trade from an early age. And it was an art in my day as well. Every pair of shoes was handmade. Well, I married my first wife, Lydia Gothridge, in 1839. And we had several children together before we decided to bring the family to America. Well, what was left of it anyway. Unfortunately, we left some children to their eternal rest back in the homeland. So when we came, it was just me, my wife, Lydia, the 2 remaining children, and my younger brother, Samuel. We settled in Baraboo in 1850, and I set up shop making shoes for those that needed them. This country certainly was different from the old country, so rustic and yet so up and coming. You know, a man could make something of himself. Well, and that's what I did. Imagine that. I was elected to become a village trustee in the first village board when Baraboo was incorporated in 1867. Imagine that, me, a shoemaker as a village trustee. Well, I served for several years. Well, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself anyway. Before I became a trustee, the family went through some hard times. I left my daughter Mary Ann in 53. And then the following year, my wife Lydia passed. And then finally, my last remaining son, little John, well, he died in 55. And that was it. My whole family from England is gone. Well, I pulled myself into my work. What else could I do? There was them that said that I was stodgy and no fun and no gaiety in my life. Well, I did let loose one day a year. At Christmas, I would get a team of 4 horses, and I'd get a sleigh, and I'd cover it with holiday trimmings, and then I'd fill it with jovial boys and girls, and we'd go riding for hours in the countryside with the sleigh bells ringing. Oh, I did marry again, Miss Mary Ann Mould, and we had another child together, a son. I named him after myself. Well, after 27 years as a shoemaker, I finally retired to a farm just south of town here at Baraboo. As that's where I expected to spend the rest of my days. And indeed I did. Just not as many as I thought. I came home from town one day and I went to water the horse. Well, I'm not too sure what happened. I think my hat fell into the cistern. And as I was trying to retrieve it with a pole, well, I fell in after it. And that was it. My days on this earth were done. So next time you're putting on your shoes or you hear the sound of jingle bells ringing, just remember old Andy Andrews, Baraboo's first shoemaker. Well, thanks for stopping by. You enjoy the rest of your walk.
Are you comfortable? Okay, so hello. My name is Catherine Warren. I was born Catherine McKinnon in Herkimer, New York in 1828. In 1855, I married the love of my life, Thompson Warren. He was born in 1812 in Maine. And yes, there is 16 years difference in our ages, though we never thought anything twice about that. In 1844, my husband moved to the Wisconsin Territory, where he began a business with his brothers in Mineral Point. There was a lot of business in Wisconsin at that time, but they soon moved to the booming settlement of Sauk City. And in Sauk City, they began a business of land acquisition and banking. Banking monies at that time could be lent for 25% or more, and land values were doubling almost overnight. The two of them soon amassed a fortune. In 1867, we moved to Baraboo. We at that time had 3 boys and 2 girls, and we wanted to have them here in the Baraboo schools. We bought a small little villa on the corner of 8th Street and Ash Street, where there was a little knoll and a very sweet place to live. We also bought a second home not too far from the cemetery here. Good thing, because we had to sell our home on Ash Street so they could put new lots there. And a certain Mr. Charles Ringling bought the lot where our house used to stand. He built his home there. You may have seen that yellow home with the carriage house. That's exactly where our house used to be. So we moved to a home, as I said, not far from here in the cemetery, and it was surrounded by woods and vineyards, and it was a lovely place. My husband was very busy, and he soon became mayor of Baraboo in 1883. He served 3 terms as mayor. We were very proud of him, and he was very, very busy, almost gone too much during that time. In 1884, he bought the Sumner Hotel in downtown Baraboo. He spruced it up, enlarged it, and put a 3rd floor on it, and we renamed it the Warren Hotel. He also at that time started a bank and bought some property in Oak Park, which is near Chicago. On one of his trips to Oak Park, checking on his property, he visited the Interstate Industrial Exposure thing, and it was a beautiful and big science project. During that time, they had things like this beautiful obelisk there. My husband was quite taken with this one, and he bought that for the price of $2,000, had it brought up here to Baraboo. His dear brother Marcus passed in 1872. Marcus's name was the first put on this obelisk, and my dear husband died in 1892, just short of his 80th birthday. Of course, his name is here as well. Let's see. we lived in the house, I said, not far from the cemetery here, and it was very, very beautiful. Baraboo is a beautiful place, as you know. I could see the Baraboo Bluffs from my second floor bedroom window. And we had a very hot summer, the summer of 1904. It was July of that year. And in the middle of the night, I woke up and I decided to open the screen on my bedroom window, the window and the screen, and then I climbed out onto the roof. I may have been sleepwalking. I'm not sure what happened, but the next thing I knew, I found myself on the ground. And later that day, I passed to my eternal rest, surrounded by my children and my beautiful, happy memories of having lived in Baraboo. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, folks. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming. My name is Thomas Jefferson Johnson. See, my folks named me after the president. They didn't know he was going to die in a few months. I think they probably would have done it anyway. It was back in 1826, so they didn't know. But I'm right proud they named me after him. Unlike Mr. Jefferson, however, I was born in the state of Maine. I married my wife, Lucy Freeman, and we lived back home for a couple of years, and then we decided to pick up and come out west to Wisconsin. We settled in a place not far from here, just a few miles up the road. Maybe you've heard of it, Kilbourne. We settled in Kilbourne. That was a boom town. That was a mighty boom town. Oh, they had great plans. The railroad was going to build a fine bridge across the Wisconsin River, and everybody was going to do fine here. Well, they didn't build it, did they? They didn't build it. The town dried up. People left. And like a lot of others, Lucy and I just moseyed right on down here to Baraboo, and we settled down here. In the summer of 1861, our pride and joy, our darling daughter Katie, was born. That wasn't the only thing that happened in 1861, though. A few months before Katie came along, the War of the Rebellion started. I enlisted on Christmas Eve Day of 1861. I was a part of the 19th Wisconsin Infantry Regiment. We fought for over 3 years together, mostly in North Carolina and Virginia. We were captured after a battle at Fair Oaks, Virginia. Me and 70 of my men were force-marched in a driving, drenching rainstorm to a place called Libby Prison. They put us inside this building, and we just had to keep walking all night long, try and keep warm, try and get warm, and then keep warm. They kept us there at Libby Prison for 3 days. Then they marched us all down to the railroad, where they put us in boxcars, 100 men to a car, and closed the door. And then we rode and rode and rode to a town called Salisbury, North Carolina. It was an old 4-story abandoned mill. They turned into kind of a hospital and a prison. They fenced in the whole area, all the grounds. When we got there, we were told that that prison was built for 2,500 men. There was about 10,000 when we arrived. Mostly we slept outside. See, they did furnish tents. They had 25 men tents, but they had 100 men in a tent. So we just slept outside. That was it. A lot of the men, they tried digging with their hands, didn't have tools, dug into side of hills and dug into the ground the best they could, but every now and again, those walls would collapse, cover them up, buried them. They did feed us, though, daily, sometimes. What they gave us to eat was some old cornbread, some ground up corn cobs, a couple of kernels of corn, and they gave us soup. We got soup most days. It was rice soup. Had about a spoon of rice, some worms in there. The whole time I was there were only 3 times where we got a couple of old rotten pieces of corned beef to nibble on. So many of the men were sick. They starved to death. They died from their injuries, had their stomachs tore up my stomach the time I was there. It was a miserable existence. Sometimes the men just couldn't take any more. There was a place called the Deadline. There's a ditch about a rod away from the fence. Armed guards stood around. Guys just had enough. They just walked towards the line. Guards would shoot them dead. You see, the guards would get a 30-day furlough for every prisoner they got that tried to escape. There were a lot of men that were nowhere near that deadline who were shot dead. Those men, they got their furloughs anyway. Well, 1865 come along, war's over, we got sent home. I come back to Wisconsin. Lucy and Katie, that was wonderful. We were blessed with the birth of our son Andrew 2 years later in 1867. Everything was just wonderful. Lucy, me, Katie, Arthur. We just had a wonderful time. Everything was great. But there's always a but. Things didn't stay great all that long. Our lovely Katie come down with consumption, and she died the last day of November of '79. I saw dozens of men die every day in that prison camp, and nothing like having your own child die. Well, I prattled on long enough. As you can see, 1898, that was mine. I'm sure glad I didn't die in that prison camp, though. Our son Arthur, he carried on the family name. I thank you all for showing up today. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. My name is Emily Cook, and as you may have already suspected, Cook was not always my last name. I was born on a farm not too far from here to the east in a lovely spot in the hills, to Henry and Mary. Ooh. They were not born here, but both were born in Pennsylvania. Their name, Henry, and his last name was Conkle. It was Emily Conkle. So, let's see. My father, Henry, came here as a young man, and he worked very hard for about 5 years. Then he bought some property, some land here, and then he went back to the east to Pennsylvania to marry my mom, Mary Wilkinson. And then they came back here to Sauk County to start their family. Now, after DeWitt and Clara and Walter, I was born in 1862, right in the middle of the War of the Rebellion. Now, I don't remember much of that at all, but I do remember how wild Sauk County was at that time. It was very common to hunt for bears. When I was about 10 years old, my father and Joseph Wilkinson treed a bear near Ikey's kiln, and they shot it in the moonlight. When I was 21 years old, I got hitched to my sweetheart, Frank Cook. We went to Portage to get married. I had a wine-colored dress with a bustle in the back and a big hoop skirt, not like you would see in today's fashion. Let's see, I had a golden hat. Oh, and the fashion at the time was to wear white gloves. So, of course, I had white gloves. Now, we settled east of Baraboo here and set up our housekeeping near my father-in-law's, near his property. At that time, he had several hundred acres to the east of Baraboo. Now, he had quite an interesting name. it was Orange Cook, Orange Huntley Cook to be exact, but I suppose it's something like if you named your child Violet or Rose, maybe. So Orange came here at the age of 22 in 1850, and he worked as a lumberjack on the Wisconsin River for several years. Then he started to farm near Baraboo here. Now, he was a very successful farmer. He met and married Lucinda, and they had several children, but sadly Lucinda died at a young age. Now Orange married Clorinda at that time, which was Lucinda's older sister. Sadly, she passed at an early age of consumption like her sister. And before, Clorinda was Frank's mother. And before she had passed, another one of his sisters and half-siblings had also passed. Now, Frank was 4 when his mom passed away, and his father, Orange, it would have been very difficult to raise a lot of children and at that time by himself. So he took another wife, Eva Felber, and Frank was basically raised by that third Mrs. Cook. So Mrs. Cook, the new Mrs. Cook, and Orange had 4 more children at that time. So my family is not quite as confusing as that. Frank and I had Ella and Mabel and Carrie, and then we had Forrest to carry on the Cook name. We farmed until about 1930 when we bought a little house in Baraboo on 9th Street. Now, we celebrated our 50th anniversary in 1933, much like my parents who celebrated their 50th anniversary in 1905. Now, even though we lived in town, it would have been very hard and was very hard to keep my Frank from the farm. So he was helping, the neighbors were threshing, and our son Forrest and the family was helping next door at the threshing. And Frank went to let one of the bulls out, and sadly the bull did attack him. We did take him up to the Ringling Hospital as soon as we could, but he passed after a couple of hours. So I held on for another 10 years. And in my lifetime, I saw from Abe Lincoln to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I saw airplanes and automobiles and other inventions. Now, the only bears that you'll see around here are at the Baraboo Zoo. Well, I've kept you long enough. Let's see. It's time for you to go on to the next group. This was my Frank's given to him by his father, Orange. So, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Walk to me now, Mystery. That's a good horse. Walk, walk. Haw to the left. That's right. Haw to the left. Good horse, Mystery. Good horse. Walk to me now. Walk to me. That's a good one. And whoa. Whoa. Sorry about that. Just a little horse talk. I think I've spent more time talking to horses than to people. But even though you're not horses, I'll talk to you. Just don't throw me. I'd like to tell you about 3 circus families that were all cousins. And no, I'm not talking about the Ringlings, the Golmars, or the Muellers, though they did have something to do with the infection. Nope, the family I refer to all have the same name, and maybe you've heard it. Rooney. I am Charles Rooney, one of the infected. It all starts with my father John and his brothers Hugh and Mike. They weren't infected, no. They were just good farmers and laborers with good Irish blood. But they did something wrong. They moved too close to Baraboo, where 3 of the largest circuses in the country got started, and then most of their kids got infected with the circus fever. Yeah. I got it real bad, as did 3 of my siblings and 9 of my cousins. Most of them became riders, show riders. I worked with circus horses too, but in a different way. When I was 18, I started out as a groom and teamster. I worked for the Golmar brothers for a while, but I went over to the Ringlings after that. And in a few years, I was able to manage an 8-horse hitch. A few years after I married Carrie in 1901, I was made the superintendent of the Ringling baggage stock. Well, my boss was old Spencer Alexander, who we called Delavan. I never did know why we called him Delavan, but we called him Delavan. And he was the boss hostler, the king of the circus lot. Yeah, a man in charge of all the horses and teamsters on the show. Well, Delavan died in 1911 and I became the boss. I loved it, except when it rained. Then things could get difficult. It was my responsibility to get the entire show, all the wagons, on and off the show lot. There were scores of wagons and hundreds of horses to deal with, and I was responsible for all of them. I tried to be fair with everyone, but when we were moving an entire city every day, I expected everyone to cooperate fully and completely and for as long as it took. Sometimes it took all night to get the show off the lot and back to the train, and I'd be in the saddle for 16 hours. Yeah. Some wagons took 2 or 4 horses to pull. Some took 6 or even 8. If conditions got bad, we might have to hitch up more teams to a wagon to get it to move, or get an elephant or 2 to help. Things got real bad, we might have to empty a wagon out and then move it. Yeah. Yeah. Once we got the show to the lot, we had the street parade to deal with. For show, sometimes we'd hitch up 12, 16, or 20 horses to pull a big wagon. A few times we did a 40-horse hitch. But the biggest one we ever pulled off was a 66-horse hitch. That was a lot of horsepower. Yeah. Yeah. When the Ringlings combined with Barnum and Bailey in 1919, Tom Lynch from the Barnum Show, well, he got to be the boss hostler, and I went over to be superintendent of stock for Tom Robinson's circus based out of Peru, Indiana. I became boss hostler again when I joined up with Hagenbeck Wallace Circus in 1925. Yeah. I was surprised when the end came in 1934. I was standing on the sidewalk in Peru and I dropped dead of a ruptured artery. Yeah. All my days truly were circus days. And I'm glad I got infected. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been king of the circus lot.
Well, thanks for coming today, everybody. This is a bigger group. If you have any trouble hearing me, please let me know, all right? My name is Samuel Franklin Amy, and you can see by this inscription I was born in Guildhall, Vermont in 1827. Guildhall is a very small place, but a person has to be from somewhere, and I obviously didn't stay there or else we wouldn't be meeting here today. I was trained as a carpenter. That's a job I did all my life. I was never very keen on ordinary, everyday carpentry though. I like a challenge. So I got into more interesting carpentry, like building bridges, and moving buildings. I am getting a little ahead of myself, though. Before I get to that, I had to get here. I came west, like a lot of other people, looking for new opportunity and growing places. You have a lot of wood in Wisconsin, and so I naturally settled here, you know, being a carpenter. I didn't want to go it alone, so in 1865 I married Miss Catherine Letitia Grissom, which you can see on here that she was born in Barnston, Canada. We lived in Prairie du Sac for a few years. We had 4 children, and then eventually we moved up here to Baraboo. In the 70s, the early 70s, I went into business with Billy Wolcott, and we opened a shop on the corner of Oak and 5th. I got a reputation for building bridges. In '79, I built one over the Baraboo River at Tucker's that was 130 feet long. Did that one in 3 spans. 2 years later, I built another at Schuster's in North Freedom, and later put 2 new spans on the big bridge across the Wisconsin River at Prairie du Sac. Had to build a model of what I proposed before I got that job. I got a lot of work repairing bridges too and saving them. In the winters, I sometimes had to go out and cut ice away from the bridge piers to keep them from getting wrecked. I got a lot of other interesting work too. In '80, I went up to Kilbourne to overhaul the Del Queen so that she could start taking passengers sightseeing up the river again. And then one time I got called to Reedsburg to drive in piles to support a brick building's foundation. Did you know half of that downtown is built on a swamp? That's why we had to drive in logs to support a brick building. I also repaired and painted the steeple on the Presbyterian church here in Baraboo. Had to build the wooden scaffolding first. That turned out to be 80 feet high. Then the repairs and the painting and taking down all the scaffolding afterward. You can probably imagine which part of the job took the longest. And in my spare time, I served as a deputy sheriff. I did that about 6 years. I worked pretty much all my life. In '05, I helped Charles Stoddard move a house, the Slinger House in Prairie du Sac. If you're keeping track, I was well into my 70s by then. And then that November, I caught a bad cold, which turned into congestion, and it eventually got the better of me. But I had a full life. I do hope some of my work is still around. And now, just for a moment, if you don't mind, I'm going to break out of character to tell you that the reason I'm playing Charles Franklin Amy today is because I am his great-great-grandson. Something that I did not know until we moved here, and my grandmother got really excited. Thanks for coming today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the tour.
Thank you for sharing this. Good? Okay. Good day. My name is Perlette Claire Carpenter, although most people call me Pearl. I was born on June 26, 1883, right here in Baraboo. My mother's name was Frances and my father was Charles. I was their only child as they married a little later in life. I didn't mind, though. That meant they doted on me. My father worked for the railroad, the Northwestern and Chicago Railroad. When I was little, he got promoted from a freight conductor to a passenger conductor. That meant that I got to ride for free anytime I wanted. Mother and I used to take lots of trips together on Father's railroad. There were a lot of trains running through Baraboo back then, all through the day and night. People from out of town wondered how we got any sleep at all, but I guess we just got used to it. My father was really proud of his job. He was even a member of the Brotherhood of Railway Conductors. Our next-door neighbor, Mr. Deacon, was also a conductor, and just up the street were several more. Almost every house on our block had someone who worked for the railroad in it. Baraboo had so many railroad employees because we were a part of a division headquarters. My father's job was good, so when I was 11, my parents decided to build a brand new house on 2nd Street. It was one of the most expensive houses in Baraboo. It cost $4,000 to build. I'm not supposed to know that, but I overheard my parents talking once. My father wanted it to be different from any other house in town, so we hired a designer from Madison to build it. It had a big front porch and a 3-story tower. I used to love to have my friends over. We'd play like we were damsel in distress locked away in a castle tower, or we'd play Rapunzel. I also used to love to sing. When I was old enough, I joined the choir at my church. We were Presbyterian, so the church was only a few blocks away. So was the high school. It was an old building built back in '69, a few years after the Civil War. People were always complaining that it should be replaced, but that didn't happen while I was there. I remember when school got done in the spring of 1901. I was turning 18 in June, so I was feeling very excited about my future that summer, but that's also when I got sick. There had been an outbreak of typhoid fever which got really bad that summer. Scores of people were getting sick all over the city. People thought it was the water. I remember my mother boiling ours to make sure it was safe. Our city water always tasted good. It came from the springs down by the mill by the river. Mrs. Zimmerly died on the 1st of August. That was really sad. She had 3 little children. The day after, I started to feel sick. I got a fever and a rash and my stomach ached. My mother and the doctor did all that they could, but the fever got so bad that I couldn't think straight. I died on August 22nd. I think my parents picked out a very nice spot up here. My life was short, but it was full of music and friends. I do wonder how it would have turned out, though, if I hadn't gotten sick.